Could China really invade Australia? It sounds impossible until you take a closer look. Australia's ties with China have been on the rocks for years. From trade wars to military expansion in the South China Sea, tensions have skyrocketed. And now, with China's growing aggression in the Indo-Pacific and fears over Taiwan, Australians are asking, could we really be next? It's not just paranoia. Experts are warning that Australia could find itself dragged into a war between the US and China, or worse, face direct threats from Beijing itself. China has the manpower, firepower, and motivation to rewrite the balance of power in the region. So is an invasion of Australia on the table? Could the land down under actually hold its ground against the massive Chinese military machine? To understand the risks, we need to look at how it all started. China's rapid military buildup and its fortification of islands in the South China Sea triggered fears across the region, especially in Australia. But things came to a boiling point in 2020 when a heated exchange over COVID-19 erupted into a trade war. China targeted Australian agriculture and steel industries, trying to strong-arm the country into submission. But Australia didn't cave. Instead, it began strengthening its defenses, knowing that its alliance with the United States would inevitably drag it into any conflict with China. And Taiwan is the biggest flashpoint. Ross Babbage, a defense expert, warns there's a 50% chance Australia could be pulled into a China-US war over Taiwan in the next 5 years. Xi Jinping is desperate to take the island. He sees it as central to his legacy. While he claims to prefer peaceful reunification, his military buildup around Taiwan suggests otherwise. If China invades Taiwan, it's inconceivable that Australia wouldn't join the fight. But that decision comes with risks. China wouldn't just target Australian military bases. It could go after civilian infrastructure, launch cyber attacks, and even activate sleeper cells to cause chaos across the country. But what about an all-out invasion? Some Australian politicians have raised the concern, and while it may sound extreme, the idea isn't entirely off the table. Without US support, Australia would face enormous challenges defending itself against a major power like China. Let's look at what the experts have to say, and what history tells us about Australia's ability to withstand an attack. Kim Beazley, a former leader of Australia's Labour Party and the current chair of the Australian War Memorial, warned that the country was too dependent on the United States for its national security. He also warned that China would face pressure by 2027 to invade Taiwan, due to a level of desperation setting in. Both Babbage and Beazley lamented that the Australian military had been allowed to atrophy after the end of the Cold War, and that successive governments in both major parties had not given it the resources it needed to maintain its readiness. An invasion of Australia would nevertheless be a formidable challenge. The Japanese conducted air raids on northern Australia at the height of their power in World War II. Still, they never attempted to actually invade the country. There was little for them to gain in doing so. The island continent was too large, and the capital of Canberra is in the southeast, thousands of miles from any potential invasion site. Those things remain true today. A full-scale invasion that takes over the entirety of Australia is out of the question. It's simply an irrational use of military force. However, could northern Australia be under threat? After all, there is some value in taking over these parts if a war broke out. First and foremost, a successful operation would allow China to tap alternate shipping routes to the Strait of Malacca. Chinese policymakers have long feared their country's dependency on the shipping that comes from this choke point that would be easy to close off in the event of war. They refer to this reality as their Malacca Dilemma. Attempts to develop alternative routes from the Persian Gulf and thence overland through Pakistan via the Belt and Road Initiative have proven less than satisfactory. Attempts at tapping overland routes through the Russian Far East have also not been able to replace the trade volume that goes through the Strait of Malacca. Greater influence in northern Australia could facilitate alternative routes through existing Indonesian straits, such as the Sunda or Lombok, bypassing the Strait of Malacca while connecting to the South China Sea, where China's influence continues to grow. Western Australia also has a lot of mines that are full of resources China needs. These resources include iron ore, rare earth elements, hydrocarbons, and even diamonds. Since China imports a lot of its resources, these mines would be an inviting prize if China managed to conquer them. So let's imagine that China, fearing a blockade of the Strait of Malacca in response to its provocations around Taiwan, decides to enact a military operation against northern Australia to secure alternative shipping lanes as part of the long and exhausting war that Babbage believes it's willing to fight. On paper, things don't look good for Australia. China's military dwarfs Australia's. Australia's armed forces include approximately 58,000 active duty personnel distributed across the Army, Navy, and Air Force. China China, on the other hand, has approximately 2 million active personnel, distributed across its Army, Navy, and Air Force. Additionally, China maintains a large reserve force of about 510,000 troops. Australia is also at a severe disadvantage in the number of ships and aircraft. China's Navy has 427 fleets, with 14 more on order as of July 25, 2024, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships. Australia has only 36 in service, although another 15 are on order. In terms of total military aircraft, China has approximately 3,377 across its Air Force, Navy, and other branches, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Aircraft. Australia, in comparison, has 447 aircraft, spanning its Army, Navy, and Air Force. The conclusion is hard to escape. Without America's help, Australia would simply find itself overpowered and outmatched in a conventional confrontation with the Chinese military, all things being equal. But as we've seen in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all things rarely are equal. Wars are not fought on paper. Look no further than Ukraine. With a vast disparity in manpower and firepower, Ukraine should have been conquered easily, but the war continues almost 3 years later. One of Russia's problems has been its inability to project power the distances required to subdue Ukraine, which is the largest country in Europe after Russia itself. Poor transport and logistics hamstrung Russian effectiveness in the first few months of the war, when it was making its broadest territorial gains. This was embarrassing because Ukraine is so close to Russia. China would have a much greater challenge. Although China has militarized islands in the South China Sea, these are too small to serve as proper bases for an expedition as ambitious as an invasion of Australia. China would need to mobilize from Hainan Island, and it would not have the element of surprise. Hainan is 2,700 miles away from Darwin, the city the Japanese once attacked. China's military has gotten much more powerful weapons thanks to its military buildup, but its logistical capacity has not accelerated in the same way. China has a military-grade transport plane capable of ferrying the needed equipment to pull off an invasion. This is the Zhan Y-20, which has a range of about 4,850 miles. That's more than enough to get troops and equipment to Australia if everything works well. But China only has 67 of them. China will likely have between 100 and 125 Y-20s by 2030, and this would help. But there is another, bigger problem. China has a shortage of tanker aircraft. Its YY-20 tanker is a significant step forward, but China only has 8 of them, with 8 per year expected to be produced between now and 2030. China's remaining tanker aircraft are far less capable Cold War-era designs that saw their genesis in the late 1940s. China's small tanker fleet would only be able to support a few Y-20 transport craft at a time, even if the invasion were launched in 2030. And this lack of tanker support is crucial, because the direct route would only be feasible if Indonesia allows China to use its airspace. Indonesia has tried to balance between China and the United States' sphere of influence, maintaining friendly relationships with both. However, Indonesia and China are both parties in the South China Sea dispute, and permitting China to use its airspace on such an expedition would invite huge international backlash, probably dwarfing what Belarus experienced for allowing Russia to use its territory to attack Kyiv in February and March 2022. China might be Indonesia's largest trading partner, but cutting itself off from the rest of the global economy is likely not something it would want to do. Additionally, it's hard to fathom how Jakarta would accept such a huge security risk of having China to its rear as well as to its front. China establishing a presence in Australia would mean Indonesia living under the threat of Chinese force from both the north and the south. It's therefore inconceivable that Indonesia would allow China to use its airspace and waters to launch an invasion of Australia. China would almost certainly be forced to take the long way to its target, around Indonesia and the Philippines and to Australia's east coast. From Hainan to there is a route of 6,500 miles, putting further stress on China's already slim tanker fleet. Indonesia's lack of support probably means that China would be forced to divert its invasion force to Cairns in Queensland, which lacks military or geostrategic value for Beijing. Unlike Darwin, which is a region that hosts a lot of vital infrastructure, including the American intelligence facility at Pine Gap, or Broome, whose geographic position would help China develop alternate trade routes that go around the Strait of Malacca, Cairns doesn't offer much beyond a place to land. From Cairns, China would need to traverse vast wildernesses through a predictable road network that would easily allow Australian defenders to figure out their enemy's destination. There are minimal natural features that would allow the movement of a hostile force to be concealed either. Australian defenders would set up fortified outposts and constantly harass the Chinese invaders with air raids and missile attacks. The Chinese Navy would be of less help in this situation than one would think. It might significantly outnumber Australia's Navy, but most of its ships consist of lighter vessels like frigates and corvettes that are not designed to operate so far from their home bases. The PLAN would also lose most of the support it enjoys within the waters of the First Island chain, where it has the advantage of missile cover from its homeland. China has missiles that can reach Australia, but not as many. There are also more choke points that the numerically inferior Australian Navy will be able to use to maximize its effectiveness against its Chinese adversary. These include the Lombok and Torres Straits and the Sea of Timor. Chinese naval aircraft would probably eventually win the day, but not without the fleet suffering significant damage. To make matters even worse, the Chinese military has not seen actual combat operations in almost 50 years, and there is no history of a Chinese naval force projecting power this far. China is not historically a sea power or a country that projects power so far from its homeland. It is institutionally a land power, whose large army was designed to defend its vast borders. China's military buildup has tried to defy this history. It's drilled and conducted anti-piracy missions at sea thousands of miles away from its homeland in an effort to get experience, but the latter is no substitute for the complexity of something as ambitious as an invasion of Australia. And this all assumes that the United States would not get involved in the conflict. Even if you ignore the mutual defense treaty between the US and Australia, there are American troops stationed there, troops that would find their way into the hostilities one way or another, meaning that Washington would have no choice but to defend those forces. Once the United States is active in the conflict, it will be almost impossible for China to reinforce its forces in Australia via maritime routes, as US naval dominance would likely impede such efforts. Geographically, this route must go through the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines. The United States has bases in the northern Philippines, thanks to the renewal of the bilateral defense agreements between Washington and Manila, and these bases will be used to attack the Chinese aircraft and tankers flying nearby. Even if an invasion were to succeed by a miracle, China would lose a lot of money and valuable military resources in the process for gains that would be unlikely to offset the cost in lost military resources and the unprecedented worldwide sanctions that would accrue. In sum, there is no conceivable way that China could make sense out of invading Australia. There are much more important things it would want to use those resources on first. Still, China does not need to invade Australia to pose a severe national security challenge to it. As it consolidates power within the limits of its 9-dash line map, its missiles and aircraft become more of a threat to Australia's northern coast. The Albanese government has attempted to revamp the military in the light of this reality, particularly to try and give it an ability to counter Chinese threats at long range so that they don't get close to Australia. These investments include a $1.3 billion purchase of the latest Tomahawk cruise missiles that have a range of about 930 miles. These missiles will be placed on the Australian Navy's Hobart-class destroyers. Canberra has spent an additional $431 million on 60 advanced anti-radiation guided missile extended-range missiles to be equipped on the Australian Air Force's Growler and Super Hornet aircraft, and eventually the F-35 as well. These missiles are specialized air-to-ground munitions designed to target radar systems. Australia's first F-35 was delivered in 2014, and in 2020, the first F-35 squadron was declared operational and is based at Tyndall. As of March 2024, the Australian Defence Department announced that 63 of the 72 F-35s it's ordered had been delivered. Australia flexed some of its new muscles at the Rim of Pacific, or RIMPAC, exercise in July 2024. During the exercise SYNCEX at RIMPAC 2024, the Royal Australian Navy successfully launched its first naval strike missile, contributing to the sinking of the decommissioned USS Tarawa. This missile system is slated for deployment on Hobart-class destroyers and Anzac-class frigates, replacing the aging Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The Naval Strike Missile boasts stealth capabilities and an operational range of approximately 160 miles. Additionally, Australia is investing in land-based missile deterrents like HIMARS, which it expects to be in service by 2026 or 27. When equipped with the new Precision Strike Missile, HIMARS has a range of 310 miles. HIMARS has the added advantage of being able to fire its payload and then disappear before a retaliatory response can reach it, unlike a ship carrying the Tomahawk and Naval Strike missiles the Australian government is investing in. The Royal Australian Navy and Air Force are getting the priority in these new investments, because any conflict involving China would be fought primarily on the sea and in the skies rather than on the land. For all of this, though, Babbage says it's not enough. He claims that the Albanese government's budget simply did not reflect the urgency of the situation. Babbage is not alone in his criticism. Even with the show of force at RIMPAC, many critics in Australia said it was not enough. The HMAS Sydney, a P-8A Poseidon aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force, and 320 troops were sent to Hawaii to participate, a total that accounted for less than 2% of the 25,000 participants from around the world. China's Navy and Air Force continue to get more powerful. It has yet another aircraft carrier on the way, and its newer, quieter submarines in the 2030s will make the situation more difficult for Australia. China continues to build more J-20 aircraft, and might have 1,000 of them by the 2030s. The more power in the South China Sea that China accumulates, the more Australia will need to spend on defending its northern coastline. But Taiwan remains the most realistic danger zone, and the Australian public seems to be growing more aware of the need to defend Taiwan. Although a majority of those polled in June 2023 still opposed sending troops to Taiwan in a hypothetical conflict, 64% of them said they would support sending arms and supplies. 61% said they would support the use of the Australian Navy to prevent China from blockading the island, a scenario China has practiced doing numerous times over the past few years. If Taiwan falls under Chinese control, it's likely that the South China Sea countries wary of China and friendly to the United States and Australia will be forced to align with it out of fear, including Indonesia, the key to northern Australia. So it's likely that Australia would have no choice but to come to Taiwan's defense, even if no treaty obligation exists. Xi Jinping aims to complete the takeover of Taiwan by 2049, the centennial of the founding of the People's Republic of China, but reality will probably require a more accelerated schedule. China's economic growth is slowing down. Its enemies, including Australia, are becoming better armed. Most of all, by the middle of the century, China's demographic problems will force it to turn inward. More money will need to be spent on care for its increasingly elderly population, and less on its military. With these realities, the Chinese leadership might feel the need to act sooner rather than later. Do you think Australia is prepared for a war with China in the near future? If not, what further moves does it need to make to be adequately ready for what will likely prove to be the most dangerous time in Indo-Pacific politics? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out India Has Had Enough of China, Get Out of Bhutan, or click this other video instead.